Hey guys, welcome back. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull up the blankets. Adjust that pillow. Turn the brightness down on your phone or your laptop, whatever you are watching this on. Tonight we're going on a long, slow, winding journey through one of the most debated documents in modern history. No rush, no quiz at the end. Just you, me, and a land treaty that may or may not have accidentally set the stage for the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen. So tonight's question is a big one. Did the Treaty of Versailles really cause World War II? No. If you went to school literally anywhere in the Western world, you probably got some version of this story. World War I ends. The Allies punish Germany. Germany gets angry. World War II happens. Boom. Straight line. Cause and effect. Clean and simple. Except history is never clean and simple. It is messy. It is complicated. It is full of petty men in fancy rooms, making decisions they didn't fully understand. And then other petty men decades later dealing with the consequences. So tonight, we're going to untangle this whole thing. Slowly, gently, like pulling apart a really old knot in a really old piece of string. Let's start at the end. Or, well, the end of the beginning. The 11th of November, 1918. The guns go quiet. After 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days of what was then called the Great War, because apparently people thought there would only be one. The fighting finally stops. And by stops, I mean an armistice is signed. No, a peace treaty, an armistice, which is basically a fancy ceasefire. Let's all agree to stop shooting each other while the adults figure out what happens next kind of deal. No. Here is where things get interesting, or, well, mildly interesting, because this is a sleep channel, and I am not here to get your heart rate up. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the Forest of Compiègne in northern France. A railway carriage. No, a palace. No, a grand hall. A train car parked in the woods, which honestly feels very on brand for this entire war. World War I was glamorous. It was mud and gas and trenches and rats and misery. So of course it ended in a railway carriage in a forest. Of course it did. The German delegation that showed up to sign wasn't even made up of the people who had been running the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had done more than almost anyone to bungle Europe into this catastrophe, had abdicated just 2 days earlier. On the 9th of November, he packed his bags and scooted off to the Netherlands, where he would spend the rest of his life in exile, chopping wood and growing a beard and generally being bitter about everything. We'll come back to him later. He is a whole thing. So the armistice is signed. The war is over. Europe looks like someone took a giant eraser to it. Entire cities flattened, landscapes cratered. Somewhere around 17 million people dead, both military and civilian. Another 20 million wounded. Empires collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire gone. The Ottoman Empire gone. The Russian Empire gone. Replaced by something arguably worse. But that is a story for another night. The German Empire also gone. Technically, Kaiser's gone. The monarchy's done. Germany is now a republic, though nobody really asked the German people if they wanted one. And in the middle of all this wreckage, the Allied powers, mainly France, Britain, the United States, and Italy, now have to figure out what to do. How do you end a war this big? How do you redraw the map of an entire continent? How do you punish the losers without accidentally starting the whole thing over again? These are really important questions. And unfortunately, the men tasked with answering them were Well, they were politicians. So, expectations managed. Let's talk about those men. Because to understand the Treaty of Versailles, you have to understand the people who wrote it. And trust me, these guys were characters. No, in a fun way. More in a this is going to be a problem way. First, there is Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, a former professor, a former president of Princeton University, a man who genuinely believed he could reshape the entire world order based on principles of democracy and self-determination and international cooperation, which is lovely, really, very idealistic, very hopeful, also very, very naive. But we'll get there. Wilson showed up to the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919, like a man on a mission from God. And honestly, he kind of thought he was. Wilson was deeply religious, Presbyterian. He believed that America had a divine purpose in the world, and that he, Woodrow Wilson, had been chosen to carry out that purpose. He had his famous 14 points, a list of principles he'd outlined in a speech back in January 1918, and he was determined to make them the foundation of the peace. Open diplomacy, free trade, freedom of the seas, disarmament, self-determination for peoples, and his pet project, a League of Nations, an international body that would prevent future wars through collective security, diplomacy. Europeans were less enthusiastic, especially the French, because while Wilson had been sitting safely across the Atlantic, France had been getting absolutely destroyed. The entire Western Front had been fought on French and Belgian soil. French cities and towns were rubble. French farmland was poisoned. French sons were dead, an entire generation gone. France had lost soldiers, almost 4.3% of its total population. And that is just military deaths. The civilian toll, the economic devastation, the psychological trauma. It was enormous. Showed up talking about peace without victory and self-determination. The French basically looked at him and said, "That is nice, Professor. No, let's talk about making Germany pay." Which brings us to George Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France. 77 years old, mean as a snake, nicknamed the Tiger. And yes, he earned that nickname. Clemenceau had been in French politics since the 1870s. He had lived through the Franco-Prussian War. He had seen Paris besieged. He had watched France lose Alsace-Lorraine to the newly unified Germany in 1871. The next 40-plus years nursing that grudge. And now, after 4 more years of war with Germany, Clemenceau wanting security. He wanted Germany weakened. Permanently. He wanted it stripped of territory, stripped of military power, stripped of industrial capacity, and forced to pay for every single franc of damage the war had caused. Clemenceau looked at Wilson's 40 points and reportedly said, "Even God Almighty only had 10, which is a pretty good line, honestly." Then there was David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a Welsh politician, charismatic, shrewd, slippery. Lloyd George was kind of stuck in the middle. Public wanted Germany punished. Make Germany pay had been a popular slogan in the 1918 British elections, and Lloyd George had ridden that wave to a massive victory. But on the other hand, Lloyd George was a pragmatist. He understood that crushing Germany completely might not be in Britain's long-term interest. A completely ruined Germany couldn't buy British goods. A completely humiliating Germany might become unstable, and an unstable Germany in the middle of Europe was, well, it was kind of how this whole mess started in the first place. So Lloyd George wanted a middle ground. Punish Germany, yes, but don't destroy it. Extract reparations, sure, but keep the German economy functional. It was a balancing act, and spoiler alert, he wasn't great at it. And finally, there was Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy. And honestly, nobody really cared what he thought. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the Allied side, after being promised territorial gains in the secret Treaty of London. And now Italy wanted those gains. Specifically, they wanted parts of Austria-Hungary along the Adriatic coast, including the city of Fiume. Wilson said no. Clemenceau didn't particularly care. Lloyd George shrugged. Orlando actually walked out of the conference at one point in protest, went back to Rome, then came back when he realized nobody had noticed he'd left, which is both sad and hilarious. Poor Orlando. He was basically the fourth wheel at a three-person dinner. So these four men, Wilson, the idealist, Clemenceau, the tiger, Lloyd George, the pragmatist, and Orlando, the other one. These were the big four, and together, in the grand halls and gilded rooms of Paris, they would spend months arguing, negotiating, compromising, and occasionally yelling at each other, all to produce the document that would define the 20th century. So, January 1919, Paris, the peace conference officially begins on the 18th of January, and already you can see the problems forming, like little cracks in a dam. Except this dam is holding back, another world war. But nobody knew that yet. Everyone was just tired and angry and trying to get the best deal for their own country. First of all, the conference was massive. Delegates from over 30 nations attended. There were representatives from Japan, from China, from Brazil, from Siam, from Liberia, from the Hejaz, was basically the precursor to Saudi Arabia. From all sorts of places. But despite all these delegations milling around, the real decisions were being made by the big four. Well, the big three, really, because, again, sorry, Orlando, everyone else was basically there to watch and occasionally submit a memo that nobody read. And here is something important to understand. Germany was not invited. Neither was Austria. Neither was Hungary. Neither was the Ottoman Empire. Neither was Soviet Russia, which had pulled out of the war in 1917 and was busy having its own catastrophic revolution and civil war. The losers were not at the table. This was a winners write the terms kind of situation, which, to be fair, was pretty well standard for peace conferences at the time. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 had been somewhat similar, but the exclusion of Germany would become a sore point. A very, very sore point. Because when you write the terms of peace without the other side having any say, and then you hand those terms over and say, sign this or else, the other side tends to feel a bit resentful, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in Paris for a while. It is January 1919. It is cold. The city is still recovering from 4 years of war. And inside the French Foreign Ministry, on the Quai d'Orsay, diplomats and politicians are beginning the long, tedious process of deciding the fate of the world. The conference was organized into dozens of committees and commissions. There were committees on territorial questions, committees on military questions, committees on financial questions, on the League of Nations, committees on labor, committees on ports, waterways, and railways. If there was a topic, there was a committee, and if there was a committee, there were arguments, long, slow, exhausting arguments. The kind that would make perfect sleep content. Honestly, Wilson spent a lot of his time pushing for the League of Nations. This was his baby, his dream. He genuinely believed that if he could just get the League established, it would solve all the other problems over time, territorial disputes. The League would handle them, arms races, The League would prevent them. Future wars, the League would stop them. It was beautiful in theory. Like most things that are beautiful in theory, it would be somewhat less beautiful in practice. But Wilson was determined. He chaired the Wilson Committee on the League of Nations himself. He worked on the covenant. He negotiated its structure. He poured his heart and soul into it. Meanwhile, Clemenceau was focused on the stuff that actually kept him up at night. France's security, the border with Germany, the Rhineland reparations, military restrictions. Clemenceau wanted the Rhineland, the region of Germany west of the Rhine River, to be turned into an independent buffer state, separate from Germany, maybe under French influence. This would give France a nice, comfortable cushion between itself and its much larger, much more populous neighbour. Wilson and Lloyd George said absolutely not. They thought creating a separate Rhineland state would be too provocative, too punitive. Instead, they offered a compromise. The Rhineland would remain part of Germany, but it would be demilitarized. No German troops allowed, and Allied forces would occupy it for 15 years just to make sure Germany behaved. Clemenceau accepted this grudgingly, partly because Wilson and Lloyd George also offered separate treaties guaranteeing that the US and Britain would come to France's defense if Germany ever attacked again. These guarantee treaties were supposed to be a substitute for the buffer state. They were supposed to make France feel safe. They never happened. The US Senate refused to ratify Wilson's guarantee treaty, and Britain said its guarantee was conditional on the American one. So France got neither. Clemenceau got played. France was left with a demilitarized Rhineland and a deep abiding sense of insecurity that would shape its foreign policy for the next 20 years. But that is getting ahead of things. Back to Paris. The negotiations dragged on through February, March, April. Wilson actually went back to the United States for a month in February and March to deal with domestic politics. There was a new Congress, and the Republicans were already making trouble. And when he came back to Paris, he found that Clemenceau and Lloyd George had been busy trying to reshape things in his absence. There were arguments about the Saar Basin, a coal-rich region on the French-German border. France wanted it. Germany had it. The compromise. The Saar would be administered by the League of Nations for 15 years, its coal mines given to France as compensation for the destruction of French mines during the war. After 15 years, the people of the Saar would vote on whether to join France, join Germany, or continue under League administration. They voted to rejoin Germany in 1935, by the way, overwhelmingly. But that is later. There were arguments about Poland. The new state of Poland was being carved out of territories that had been part of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. Wilson's 13-point, yes, specific, the 13th of his 14 points, called for an independent Poland with access to the sea. The problem was, the most logical sea access was through territory that had a large German population, the city of Danzig, for example. Modern-day Gdańsk was overwhelmingly German-speaking. The solution, Danzig became a free city under League of Nations protection, and Poland got a corridor of land, the Polish corridor, that cut through German territory to reach the Baltic Sea. This split East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Germans hated it deeply. The Polish corridor would become one of the most contentious territorial issues of the interwar period, and it would eventually be one of Hitler's excuses for invading Poland in 1939. But again, later, there were arguments about colonies. Germany had overseas colonies in Africa and the Pacific, what to do with them. Wilson didn't want the Allies to just grab them outright. That would look too much like old-fashioned imperialism. And Wilson was supposed to be above that sort of thing. So they came up with the Elacine mandate system. The colonies would be administered by various allied powers: Britain, France, Japan, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. But technically they would be mandates of the League of Nations. The administering powers were supposed to be preparing these territories for eventual self-governance. In practice, the mandate system was just colonialism wearing a nice hat. But it made Wilson feel better, and that was apparently what mattered. There were arguments about Japan. Japan had entered the war on the Allied side and had seized German territories in China, specifically the Shandong Peninsula and German islands in the Pacific. Japan wanted to keep these. China, which had also joined the Allies, wanted Shandong back. Wilson was sympathetic to China, but Japan threatened to walk out of the conference, and Wilson needed Japan in the League of Nations. So Shandong went to Japan. China was furious. The Chinese delegation refused to sign the treaty. Back in China, the decision sparked the May 4th movement, a massive wave of nationalist protest that would have profound effects on Chinese politics and eventually contribute to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. So, consequences. Japan also proposed that the Covenant of the League of Nations include a racial equality clause, a statement affirming the equality of all races and nations. Wilson, who was presiding over the League Committee, ruled that the proposal had failed because it didn't receive unanimous support, even though it got a majority of votes. Many historians believe Wilson killed the proposal because he knew it would be politically toxic in the United States, where racial segregation was the law of the land, and also because Australia was vehemently opposed, since it had a white Australia immigration policy that it had no intention of giving up. So the racial equality clause died. Japan was insulted, and one more little seed of resentment was planted. All of these negotiations, and dozens more, were happening simultaneously. Different committees meeting in different rooms, producing different reports, all feeding into the main drafting process. It was bureaucratic chaos, dressed up in formal suits and diplomatic language. And through it all, the big three, Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, kept meeting. Wilson got sick in April, possibly with the flu. The 1918 influenza pandemic was still raging, and some historians have argued that his illness affected his judgment and made him more willing to give in to French and British demands. Whether that is true or not, the final treaty certainly contained more punitive elements than Wilson's original 14 points would have suggested. By late April, the treaty was more or less complete, and it was time to show it, Germany. So, the Treaty of Versailles. Let's go through it now. Every single article. There were 440 of them, and we'd be here until sunrise. But the big ones, the ones that mattered, the ones that would echo through the next 2 decades, like a drumbeat getting steadily louder. Let's start with territory. Germany lost about 13% of its pre-war territory, and about 10% of its population, which is significant. No, completely dismembered significant. Definitely out significant. In the West, Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. This was expected. France had lost these territories in 1871, and getting them back was non-negotiable. The Saar Basin, as I mentioned, went under League administration for 15 years. The tiny territories of Eupen and Malmedy went to Belgium, and the Rhineland, the whole left bank of the Rhine, plus a 50-kilometer strip on the right bank, was to be permanently demilitarized. No German military forces, no fortifications, nothing. Allied troops would occupy the Rhineland in stages, withdrawing over 15 years, assuming Germany behaved. In the east, The losses were more painful. The Polish corridor, as we discussed, carved through German territory to give Poland access to the sea. West Prussia and most of the province of Posen to Poland. Danzig became a free city. Parts of Upper Silesia went to Poland after a plebiscite in 1921, though that plebiscite was deeply controversial and accompanied by armed uprisings because of Of course it was. Memel, a small territory on the Baltic coast, was detached from Germany and eventually seized by Lithuania in 1923. And the big one, all of Germany's overseas colonies were gone, handed over as League mandates to various Allied powers. In the north, a plebiscite was held in Schleswig, and northern Schleswig voted to join Denmark. Southern Schleswig voted to stay with Germany. That one was actually fairly clean and democratic, which is nice. A rare bright spot. Germany also had to recognize the independence of Austria and Czechoslovakia, and was forbidden from uniting with Austria. This is called the Anschluss Prohibition. It was specifically designed to prevent Germany from getting bigger by absorbing the German-speaking rump of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler would violate this in 1938. But again, we'll get there. Slowly, like a trainer approaching a station, it has no intention of stopping at. No military restrictions. This is where it gets really specific. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. 100,000 for a country of 60 million people. For context, France alone maintained an army of several 100,000. None. Zero. The German Air Force was abolished entirely. Germany was not allowed to have military aircraft. No tanks. No heavy artillery. The General Staff, the legendary Prussian military planning body, was dissolved. Military conscription was abolished. The army was to be a volunteer professional force only. These restrictions were supposed to be a first step. The treaty said they were intended to render possible the initiation of a general limitation of the armaments of all nations. In other words, Germany was being disarmed first, and then everyone else would follow. Except everyone else didn't follow. France didn't disarm. Britain didn't disarm. Nobody disarmed. Germany was the only one who had to, which made the whole thing feel less like a step toward universal peace, and more like, well, punishment. No. Let's talk about the part of the treaty that would generate the most controversy, the most bitterness, and the most arguments in both beer halls and history seminars for the next century. Article 231. The War Guilt Clause. Article 231 reads, "The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." No. Here is the thing. From the Allied perspective, this article was primarily a legal basis for reparations. It was the foundation for saying, Germany caused the war, therefore Germany has to pay for the damage. It was a legal mechanism, a necessary clause to justify the financial demands that followed. The lawyers who drafted it weren't necessarily making a grand moral pronouncement about the origins of the war. They were building a legal argument. But from the German perspective, this was a moral condemnation, an accusation, a humiliation. Germany was being forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, and Germans, virtually all Germans, across the political spectrum, rejected this utterly. They did not believe Germany alone had caused the war. They pointed to Russian mobilization, to French revanchism, to the complex web of alliances that had dragged everyone into the conflict. And they had a point. The origins of World War I are extraordinarily complex. Entire libraries have been written about who was responsible. The idea that it was all Germany's fault is, well, it is an oversimplification at best. But the war guilt clause wasn't really about historical accuracy. It was about money, reparations. And oh boy, the reparations. The treaty itself didn't specify the total amount Germany would have to pay. That was left to a reparations commission, which would figure out the final bill by May 1921. In the meantime, Germany was required to make an initial payment of 20 billion gold marks. When the commission finally announced its figure in 1921, the total was 132 billion gold marks, which was an astronomical sum, roughly equivalent to, well, it depends on how you calculate it, but somewhere in the range of $400 billion in today's money. Give or take, the actual payment schedule was complicated. There were different categories of bonds, and the real expected payment was actually lower than the headline figure, but the number 132 billion was the one that stuck in people's minds. And it was staggering. The reparations were supposed to cover civilian damages, pensions for Allied veterans and their families, and the cost of rebuilding destroyed infrastructure. Clemenceau wanted every centime. Lloyd George, who had initially pushed for including pensions in the bill, which massively inflated the total, wanted a number that sounded impressive to British voters. Wilson went along with it, partly because he was exhausted, and partly because he figured the League of Nations would sort out any problems down the road. The reparations issue would dominate European politics for the next decade and a half. Germany would struggle to pay. France would insist on payment. Britain and America would try to find compromise positions. There would be crises, negotiations, new plans, more crises, more negotiations. The Dawes Plan in 1924, the Young Plan in 1929, each one trying to find a workable solution. And in the end, Germany never paid the full amount. No, even close. But the resentment, the resentment was paid in full. There were other provisions too. Germany had to hand over its merchant fleet. It had to deliver enormous quantities of coal to France, Belgium, and Italy. It had to give up most of its railway rolling stock. It had to allow Allied goods into Germany duty-free, while accepting that its own exports could still be hit with tariffs. The Kiel Canal was open to international traffic. German rivers were internationalized. Germany lost its patents, its trademarks, its overseas assets. The list went on. And then there was the matter of Kaiser Wilhelm. The treaty called for him to be tried by an international tribunal for a supreme offense against international morality and the sanctity of treaties. This would have been the first time a head of state was put on trial for starting a war. But the Netherlands, where Wilhelm was living in exile, refused to extradite him. Government said it had a tradition of offering asylum, and it wasn't about to break it for the Allies. So Wilhelm never stood trial. He just stayed in the Netherlands, chopping wood, and occasionally ranting about how everything was someone else's fault. He died in 1941 during the German occupation of the Netherlands. Still in exile, the Nazis offered him a state funeral. His family declined on his behalf. A weird, anticlimactic end for a man who had once been one of the most powerful rulers in the world. So that is the treaty. In broad strokes: territory lost, army slashed, navy sunk, air force abolished, war guilt accepted, reparations demanded, colonies gone, and Germany had no say in any of it. Let's drift over to Germany now. May 1919. The treaty has been drafted. A German delegation has been summoned to Versailles. Not to negotiate, mind you, but to receive the terms. They arrive on the 29th of April and are handed the document on May 7th. They're given 15 days to submit written comments. That is it. No face-to-face negotiations. No back and forth across a table. Just, here is the treaty. Write us a letter if you have concerns. The head of the German delegation was Count Ulrich von Brockdorf. Rantzau, a diplomat. Aristocratic, prickly. He had a monocle because, of course, he did. Speech in which he accepted that Germany bore some responsibility for the war but rejected the idea of sole guilt. He also pointed out, rather sharply, that hundreds of thousands of German civilians had died because of the Allied naval blockade, which had continued even after the armistice, a fact that was true and that the Allies generally preferred not to discuss. Brockdorf-Rantzau delivered his speech while seated, which the Allies interpreted as a deliberate insult. He later claimed it was because his legs were shaking too much to stand, which is either a great excuse or genuinely tragic, depending on how charitable you are feeling. Back in Germany, the reaction to the treaty was volcanic. No, in a dramatic Hollywood way, more in a slow, deep, society-wide way. Every political party, from the far left to the far right, denounced it. Newspapers called it a diktat, a dictated peace, a punishment imposed without consent. The Chancellor, Philipp Scheidmann, stood before the National Assembly and declared, "Hand would not wither that binds itself and us in these fetters." It was a rhetorical question. He was saying he could never sign such a thing. And then, after much agonizing, Germany signed it. Because what choice did they have? The alternative was a resumption of the war. And Germany was in no position to fight. The army was demobilized. The country was exhausted. The Allied blockade was still in effect, and people were still going hungry. The Allies made it clear, sign the treaty, or we march in. So Germany signed. Scheidmann resigned rather than put his name on it. The new Chancellor, Gustav Bauer, authorized the signing. And on the 28th of June, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the event that had started the whole catastrophe, 2 German representatives, Hermann Miller and Johannes Bell, walked into the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles and signed the whole treaty. The Hall of Mirrors. Think about that for a second. This was the same room where, in January 1871, the German Empire had been proclaimed after Prussia's victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck had deliberately chosen Versailles, the symbol of French royal glory, to humiliate France. And now, 48 years later, France was returning the favor. Clemenceau specifically chose the Hall of Mirrors for the signing ceremony. It was revenge dressed up as protocol. Petty. Absolutely. Effective as a psychological blow. Also, absolutely. The signing was a somber affair. The 2 German delegates looked miserable. The Allied leaders looked satisfied, or at least tired. Cannons fired outside. Crowds cheered, but inside, in that seed glittering hall, with all its mirrors and chandeliers and gold, there was a heaviness. Even some of the Allied delegates felt it. A sense that this wasn't quite right, that something had gone wrong, or was about to. Harold Nicholson, a young British diplomat who attended the ceremony, later wrote, "It was not a piece of justice. It was not a piece of reconciliation. It was a piece of vengeance." And he worked for vengeance. The British delegation. Even on the winning side, people had doubts. But the treaty was signed. It was done. And now everyone had to live with it. Let's talk about what happened next in Germany. because the internal politics of Germany in the 1920s are crucial to understanding whether the treaty caused World War II, and they're also a fascinating, slow-motion train wreck that pairs perfectly with a warm blanket and a darkened room. The new German government, the Weimar Republic, named after the city where its constitution was drafted, was in trouble from day one. Actually, from before day one, the Republic had been proclaimed. On the 9th of November, 1918, 2 days before the armistice, in the chaos of revolution, Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated. Sailors had mutinied. Workers' and soldiers' councils were forming across the country. There was genuine fear of a Bolshevik-style revolution. The Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert, who became the first president, was a moderate man trying to hold a moderate line in deeply immoderate times. And here is where we encounter one of the most pernicious myths of the interwar period. The stab in the back legend, the Dolchstoßlegende. This was the idea promoted by right-wing nationalists, former military officers, and eventually the Nazis, that the German army had never actually been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, according to this myth, Germany had been stabbed in the back by traitors on the home front, socialists, communists, Jews, war profiteers, politicians who had negotiated the armistice, the November criminals who had signed away Germany's honor. This was nonsense. The German army in November 1918 was exhausted, overstretched, and losing. The spring offensives of 1918 had failed. High Command, specifically Erich Ludendorff, who had essentially been running the war for the last 2 years, had told the government that the military situation was hopeless and that an armistice was necessary. Ludendorff himself had demanded the armistice, but then, conveniently, he let the civilian politicians handle the actual negotiations, which meant the civilians took the blame for the surrender, while the military brass pretended they could have won, if only they hadn't been betrayed. It was a spectacularly cynical move, and it worked. The stab in the back myth took root in German culture. It was repeated in newspapers, in speeches, in beer halls, in memoirs. It poisoned the Welk for the Weimar Republic from the very beginning. Because if you believe the legend, then the Republic itself was born of treason. The politicians who ran it were traitors, and the Treaty of Versailles, which those traitors had signed, was an illegitimate punishment imposed on a country that hadn't even really lost. This is important, really important, because the treaty and the stab in the back myth became intertwined. The treaty was the physical evidence of the betrayal, every lost territory, every reparation, payment, every military restriction was a reminder, not of Germany's defeat, but of Germany's humiliation by its own leaders. The treaty didn't just anger Germans because of what it contained, angered them because of what it symbolized. And what it symbolized in the minds of millions was injustice. No. Was the anger justified? Partly yes. The treaty was harsh. The war guilt clause was insulting. The reparations were enormous. The exclusion of Germany from the negotiations was humiliating. But was the anger proportionate? That is harder to say. Other countries had it worse. The Treaty of Trianon, imposed on Hungary, stripped it of 70% of its territory and 60% of its population. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed on the Ottoman Empire, basically carved it up entirely. Compared to those, Versailles was, well, it wasn't gentle, but it wasn't annihilation either. Germany remained a large, populous, industrially powerful country. It lost territory, yes, but it kept its core. It was weakened, but it was intact. The problem was perception. And in politics, perception is everything. Germans perceived the treaty as uniquely unjust, and that perception was stoked, deliberately, by people who had their own political agendas. Right-wing nationalists used the treaty to attack the Republic. Communists used it to attack the capitalist order. And eventually, a certain failed artist from Austria would use it to attack, well, everything. But we're not there yet. We're still in the early 1920s, and things are about to get economically interesting, by which I mean disastrous. Let's settle into the 1920s. The lights are dim, the decade is turbulent, and Germany's economy is about to do something truly spectacular in the worst possible way. So, reparations. Germany owed 132 billion gold marks, as determined by the Reparations Commission in May 1921. This was broken down into 3 series of bonds: A bonds, B bonds, and C bonds, and B bonds. Totaling 50 billion gold marks were the ones Germany was actually expected to pay in the near term. The C bonds, 82 billion marks, were widely understood to be more symbolic, something to be dealt with in the distant future, if ever. But the headline number was still 132 billion, and that was the number that dominated public discourse. Germany made its first payment of 1 billion gold marks in mid-1921. It was a struggle. The German economy was already stressed from the war. Inflation was already a problem, since the German government had financed much of the war through borrowing rather than taxation. And now the chickens were coming home to roost. Or rather, the chickens were coming home, finding the roost worthless, and demanding to be paid in something more stable. In early '20, Germany asked for a moratorium on reparations payments. France said no. Well, Raymond Poincaré said no. Poincaré was the new French president. Actually, he was the president of the Council of Ministers, basically the Prime Minister. And he was even more hardline than Clemenceau had been. Poincaré believed that Germany was deliberately sabotaging its own economy to avoid paying reparations. And, you know what? He might have been partly right. There were elements within the German government and German industry that were perfectly happy to let the currency slide because a weaker mark made German exports cheaper and made reparations harder to pay in real terms. Whether this was a deliberate strategy or just convenient side effects of genuine economic dysfunction is still debated. Regardless, by late '20 had fallen behind on its reparation payments. Specifically, it was behind on deliveries of coal and timber. Poincaré decided enough was enough. On January 7th, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. The plan was to take control of the coal mines and steel factories and extract reparations directly. If Germany wouldn't pay, France would take. The occupation of the Ruhr was, depending on your perspective, either a justified enforcement action or a massive overreaction. Britain was opposed. The United States was disapproving but technically not involved, having never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was outraged. The government under Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno declared a policy of passive resistance, essentially a general strike in the Ruhr, supported by government subsidies. Workers refused to cooperate with the French occupation. Mines and factories shut down. Rail workers refused to run trains. Civil servants refused to follow French orders. It was a bold stance. It was also economically suicidal. Because to fund the passive resistance and keep paying the striking workers, the German government did the one thing it knew how to do: printed money and printed money and printed more money. The printing presses ran day and night, and the value of the German mark, which had already been declining, went into freefall. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes of hyperinflation in history. No, the worst ever. Hungary after World War II and Zimbabwe in the 2000s hold those records, but certainly most famous. In January 1921, $1 was worth about 65 marks. By July 1922, it was 493 marks. By January 1923, it was 17,792 marks. By July 1923, it was 353,412 marks. 9th of September, 8.8 million marks. By the 2nd of October, 5.2 billion marks. And by November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. 4.2 trillion, that is a 4, with 12 zeros after it. The stories from this period are almost absurd. People would get paid in the morning and rush to spend the money before it lost value by the afternoon. Housewives would go shopping with wheelbarrows full of banknotes. Children used stacks of worthless bills as building blocks. A cup of coffee might cost thousands of marks when you ordered it and millions by the time you finished drinking it. Savings accounts, pensions, insurance policies, anything denominated in marks became worthless overnight. Middle-class families who had saved their entire lives woke up one morning and found their entire lives' savings could buy a loaf of bread. Maybe this was devastating. No, in a people are starving in the streets way. Though there was real hardship, but in a psychological, spiritual, foundational way. Mittelstand, the backbone of German society. These people had played by the rules. They had saved. They had invested. They had trusted the currency and the system had annihilated them. Their trust in institutions, in government, in the basic social contract, was shattered. And once that trust is gone, it is very hard to get it back. Into that vacuum, extremism flourishes. No, here is where we need to be careful about the narrative, because the hyperinflation of 1923 was terrible, but it was also temporary. It was brought under control. In November 1923, a newly Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial assets. The old marks were exchanged at a rate of 1 trillion to 1, passive resistance. The Ruhr ended. Negotiations began for a new reparations settlement. And by 1924, the Dawes Plan, named after American banker Charles Dawes, restructured Germany's reparation payments, provided a large loan from American banks, and stabilized the situation. The mid to late 1920s were actually okay, no. Great, but okay. The German economy recovered. Cultural life flourished. This was the era of the Weimar Renaissance of Bauhaus architecture, of Bertolt Brecht, of Fritz Lang, of Marlene Dietrich. Berlin became one of the most vibrant, cosmopolitan cities in the world. The political situation calmed down somewhat. Stresemann, who served as foreign minister from 1923 until his death in 1929, pursued a policy of reconciliation and cooperation with the Western powers. He negotiated the Locarno treaties in 1925, which guaranteed Germany's western borders and earned him and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand the Nobel Peace Prize. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. Things were looking up. These years, roughly 1924 to 1929, are sometimes called the Golden Twenties in Germany. And there is some truth to that. But the gold was thin. The recovery was built on a shaky foundation. American loans propped up the German economy. If those loans were ever called back or stopped flowing, well, let's not think about that. Let's just enjoy the jazz music and the expressionist paintings while they last, because they weren't going to last. And that brings us to a crucial point in our story. The thing that many historians argue was actually more important than the Treaty of Versailles in causing World War II. The thing that turned a resentful but recovering Germany into a desperate, radicalized Germany. The thing that nobody in 1925 or 1926 or 1927 saw coming, even though maybe they should have, the Great Depression. But let's ease into that gently, like sliding into a warm bath full of economic catastrophe, but warm nonetheless. So it is 1929. Stresemann dies in October, and then on the 24th of October and 29th, the American stock market crashes. Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, the names are dramatic, the consequences were worse. The crash itself wasn't the cause of the Great Depression. That is an oversimplification, but it was the trigger, or maybe the first domino. American banks, which had been lending money all over the world, suddenly needed that money back. Credit dried up, international trade collapsed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and the whole interconnected global economy, which had seemed so stable and so modern, started unraveling like a cheap sweater. Germany was hit particularly hard, because remember those American loans that were propping up the German economy, they got called back. American banks wanted their money, and without that money, German businesses couldn't function, banks failed, factories closed. Unemployment, which had been around 5 or 6% in 1928, skyrocketed. By 1930 it was 15%. By 1931, 23%. By 1932, over 30%. 6 million Germans were out of work. 6 million. In a country of 65 million. That is nearly 1 in 10 of the total population, and a much higher percentage of the working age population. The human toll was immense. Families that had just barely recovered from the hyperinflation of 1923 were now plunged back into poverty. Hunger returned. Homelessness increased. Soup kitchens appeared on city streets. Young men, who should have been starting careers, found nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no future. Just long lines at the unemployment office, and a growing sense that the system had failed them. And the Weimar Republic, that fragile democratic experiment, started cracking under the pressure. The political system was designed for consensus and compromise, but consensus and compromise are hard to maintain when people are hungry and scared. The moderate parties, the Social Democrats, the Centre Party, the German Democratic Party, lost support. The extremes gained. On the left, Communist Party grew. On the right, a party that had been marginal, almost joke-like, throughout the 1920s suddenly surged. The National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis. No, we need to talk about the Nazi rise to power. But let's keep it calm. Let's keep it analytical. This isn't a thriller. It is a history podcast for sleepy people. So let's just walk through it, step by step, like crossing a stream on stepping stones. Adolf Hitler, born in Austria in 1889, failed artist, served in World War I as a corporal, was gassed, was decorated, experienced the end of the war and the revolution as a personal trauma. The German Workers' Party in 1919 renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party and gradually took it over through sheer force of personality, oratory skill, and willingness to use violence. He attempted a coup in Munich in 1923, the beer hall putsch, and it failed spectacularly. He was arrested tried and sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he served about 90 months. During that time, he dictated a book. You've probably heard of it. It is not good literature, but it laid out his worldview with uncomfortable clarity. Throughout the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party was small. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, they won 2.6% of the vote, 12 seats out of 491. They were a fringe party, loud, violent, extreme, but fringe. Most Germans didn't take them seriously, and then the Depression hit, and suddenly everything changed. In the 1930 elections, the Nazis won 18.3% of the vote, 107 seats. They went from the 9th largest party to the 2nd largest. Over 1932, they won 37.3%, 230 seats. Were now the largest party in the Reichstag. No, a majority, but the largest single bloc. It was a stunning, terrifying rise. Why? What changed? Well, the Depression changed everything. But the Depression alone doesn't explain why people turned specifically to the Nazis. After all, the Communist Party also grew during the Depression. People had choices. They could have gone left. Many did. But millions went right. Why? This is where the Treaty of Versailles re-enters our story. Because the Nazi message was, in many ways, built on the treaty. Hitler railed against the diktat of Versailles. He denounced the war guilt clause. He promised to tear up the treaty and restore Germany's honor, its territory, its military power. He pointed to the reparations as proof that the Allies wanted to enslave Germany. The stab-in-the-back myth naming the November criminals and their descendants as the enemy within. He promised to unite all Germans in a greater Germany, including those in Austria, in the Sudetenland, in the Polish corridor, all territories that had been affected by the post-war settlement. The treaty gave Hitler a narrative, a story of injustice and betrayal, a story that resonated with millions of Germans who felt humiliated, would have had to find a different narrative. Maybe he would have. He was a gifted, and I use that word very reluctantly, grievance that almost every German shared regardless of political affiliation. Even people who despised the Nazis agreed that the treaty was unjust. That common ground was a gateway. Hitler used it to draw people in and then radicalize them further. But, and this is crucial, the treaty alone didn't put Hitler in power. The Depression did the heavy lifting. If the German economy had remained stable, if unemployment had stayed low, golden 20s had continued, the Nazis would likely have remained a fringe movement. People don't turn to extremism when things are going well. They turn to extremism when they're desperate. The Depression made them desperate. So was it the treaty? Or was it the Depression? Or was it something else entirely? Let's keep going. The answer, like most historical answers, is it is complicated. And complicated answers are the best kind for late-night listening. They don't jolt you awake. They just settle into your brain like a slow fog. Let's float forward. It is the early 1930s. Germany is in crisis. The Weimar Republic is dying. No, with a bang, but with a long, slow whimper. The political system was paralyzed. No party could form a stable majority in the Reichstag. Chancellors came and went. Heinrich Brüning governed from Fodin to Two, using emergency decrees issued by President Hindenburg under Article 5 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed the president to bypass parliament in times of crisis. This was technically legal, but deeply undemocratic. Brüning imposed austerity measures, spending cuts, tax increases. during the worst economic crisis in modern history, austerity during a depression, which is a bit like treating dehydration by draining blood. It made things worse, much worse. Breuning was replaced by Franz von Papen in June. Sidon Papen was an aristocrat, a schemer, a man of limitless ambition and limited talent. He thought he could control the Nazis, use them, let Hitler be chancellor, surround him with conservatives, and pull the strings from behind. "We've hired him," Papen reportedly said, famous last words. Well, not literally last. Papen survived the war and lived until 1969. But famous, foolish words. Before Papen's plan could be implemented, there was another chancellor, Kurt von Schleicher, a general and political operator, who lasted all of 57 days. Schleicher tried to split the Nazi party by offering the vice-chancellorship to Gregor Strasser, one of Hitler's lieutenants. It didn't work. Strasser resigned from the party instead. Schleicher's government collapsed, and on January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg, who personally disliked Hitler and had once called him the Bohemian Corporal, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hindenburg was 85 years old. He was tired. He was confused. He was surrounded by advisors who told him that Hitler could be managed, that the conservatives in the cabinet would keep him in check, that giving him the chancellorship was the safest option, because it would bring the Nazis into the system and tame them. They were wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically, historically wrong. Within months, Hitler had consolidated power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him a pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March gave him the power to pass laws without parliament. Political parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. Political opponents were arrested, beaten, or killed. By the summer of 1933, Germany was a one-party dictatorship. By August 50, when Hindenburg died and Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, the transformation was complete. Hitler was fit rare, absolute ruler, and now he set about dismantling the Treaty of Versailles. Piece by piece, methodically, brazenly, and the rest of the world watched and did almost nothing. In 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference. In 1935, Hitler announced the reintroduction of conscription and the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German air force that the treaty had forbidden. The army would expand far beyond the 100,000-man limit. Nobody stopped him. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone. This was a direct, undeniable violation of the treaty. It was also a huge gamble. The German army was still relatively weak. If France had responded with military force, Germany would almost certainly have backed down. Hitler himself later admitted that the 48 hours after the march were the most nerve-wracking of his life. But France didn't respond. Britain counseled against overreacting. True in a narrow geographical sense, but missed the point entirely. In March 1938, the Anschluss, Germany annexed Austria. Forbidden by the treaty, the Austrian government was coerced into accepting the takeover. The Western powers protested verbally and did nothing else. Austrians lined the streets and cheered. For the most part, or at least the cheering, was the part that made it onto the newsreels. In September 1938, the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded it. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, met with Hitler at Munich and gave it him. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the meeting. Sound familiar? Neville Chamberlain, The British Prime Minister flew back to London and waved a piece of paper and declared peace for our time. It was not peace for our time. It was barely peace for another year. In March 1939, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the moment when even the most determined appeasers had to admit that Hitler's ambitions went beyond undoing Versailles. He wasn't just reclaiming German territory or German-speaking populations. He was conquering non-German lands. The fiction that he was merely correcting the injustices of the treaty was shattered. Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence. They drew a line. If Hitler crossed it, there would be war. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun, and now we arrive at the big question. The question that has filled entire bookshelves and fueled countless late-night arguments between historians. The question you probably came here to hear answered, though I suspect by now you might be pleasantly drowsy, which is the whole point. Did the Treaty of Versailles cause World War II? The short answer is sort of, but not really. But also yes, but also no, which is a terrible answer, I know, but it is the honest one. So let's unpack it slowly in our usual meandering way. The case for yes, the treaty caused World War II, goes something like this. The treaty was too harsh. It humiliated Germany. It imposed crippling reparations. It took territory that Germans considered rightfully theirs. It forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for a war that had many causes. All of this created a deep, burning resentment in German society. A resentment that politicians and demagogues could exploit. The treaty gave Hitler his most powerful propaganda tool. Without the treaty, there would have been no stab in the back myth, no war guilt outrage, reparations crisis, no hypernationalism built around restoring lost territories. Without the treaty, Hitler either would never have risen to power or would have had a much harder time doing so. This argument has been around almost as long as the treaty itself. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, published The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, the same year the treaty was signed, and argued that the reparations were economically unsustainable and would lead to disaster. Keynes was brilliant and prophetic, though he was also personally biased. He had been part of the British delegation at Paris and had resigned in protest. And some of his specific criticisms have been challenged by later scholarship. But his basic point, that you can't impoverish a major European nation and expect it to remain peaceful, was widely shared and proved broadly correct. The yes case also points to the specific territorial grievances created by the treaty. The Polish corridor, Danzig, the Sudetenland, the Anschluss prohibition, these were the stepping stones. Hitler used to dismantle the European order. Each time he moved, he could claim he was merely correcting an injustice, merely reuniting Germans who had been separated, merely undoing Versailles, because so many people, including many people in Britain and France, agreed that the treaty had been too harsh. They were willing to let him get away with it. Appeasement was, in large part, on a guilty conscience. The Allies felt, on some level, that maybe they had overdone it in 1919, and that guilt made them hesitant to confront Hitler when confrontation might still have worked. So that is the yes case, and it is compelling, but it is not the whole story. The case for no, the treaty didn't cause World War II, or at least not by itself, is equally strong, and it goes something like this. First, the treaty wasn't actually that harsh. I know. We just spent a lot of time talking about how harsh it was, but compared to what? Compared to what Germany imposed on Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In March 1918, Versailles was a love letter. Brest-Litovsk stripped Russia of a third of its population, half of its industrial capacity, and 90% of its coal mines. Germany forced these terms on Russia when it had the upper hand, and it showed no mercy. Versailles was gentler by comparison, and comparison to what Germany had planned if it won the war in the West. The September Programme of 1914 outlined annexation of Luxembourg, parts of Belgium and France, economic domination of Europe. Versailles was downright restrained. Second, the reparations, while large on paper, were repeatedly reduced and rescheduled. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929 both lowered the payments and stretched out the schedule. In 1932, at the Lausanne Conference, reparations were effectively cancelled altogether. Germany ended up paying only a fraction of the original amount, roughly 20 to 22 billion gold marks out of the SE 132 billion assessed. The reparations were a burden, yes, but they weren't the crushing, impossible weight that Nazi propaganda and Keynes portrayed them as. Some historians, like Sally Marks, Stephen Schuker, have argued that Germany could have paid more if it had genuinely tried, and that much of the inability to pay was politically motivated obstructionism. Third, and most importantly, the treaty didn't make Hitler inevitable. The leap from resentful populace to genocidal dictator starts a world war is enormous. It required a specific set of circumstances. The Depression, the failures of the Weimar political system, the cynicism of conservative elites who thought they could control the Nazis, the personal charisma and ruthlessness of the Weimar Hitler himself, to come together in a very specific way. Change any one of those variables, and the outcome might have been different. What if the Depression hadn't happened? The Nazis were going nowhere in 1928. They needed economic catastrophe to become a mass movement. The Depression wasn't caused by the treaty. It was caused by structural failures in the global economy, particularly the American financial system. You could argue that reparations contributed to German economic vulnerability, and that is fair. But the Depression was a worldwide event. Countries that had nothing to do with Versailles, the United States, Brazil, Australia, were hit just as hard. What if Hindenburg hadn't appointed Hitler? What if the conservative elites had rallied behind a different solution? What if the Social Democrats and Communists had cooperated instead of fighting each other? The rise of Hitler was not a foregone conclusion. It was the result of human choices, bad choices, cowardly choices, self-interested choices, made by specific people at specific moments. What if the Western powers had enforced the treaty when it mattered? When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, he was violating the treaty, and France had the legal right and the military capability to stop him. If France had acted, the whole trajectory of the 1930s might have been different. The treaty wasn't the problem there. The failure to enforce it was. This is the paradox that many historians point to. The treaty was either too harsh or not harsh enough. It was harsh enough to create resentment, but not harsh enough to actually prevent Germany from becoming a threat again. It humiliated Germany without crippling it. It imposed restrictions without ensuring they could be enforced. It was, in the famous formulation, too gentle for what was harsh in it, and too harsh for what was gentle. The French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, when he heard the terms of the treaty in 1919, reportedly said, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by about 2 months. The treaty was signed in June 1919. World War II began in September 1939, 20 years and about 2 months. Foch's prediction was eerily accurate. But what he meant was that the treaty didn't go far enough. It didn't permanently weaken Germany. It didn't split it up or occupy it indefinitely. Foch wanted a separate Rhineland state. He wanted the River Rhine as France's border. He wanted Germany reduced to a size that could never threaten France again. He didn't get what he wanted, and he believed correctly, as it turned out, that Germany would be back. So was the problem that the treaty was too harsh, or that it wasn't harsh enough. The answer, frustratingly, is that it was the wrong kind of treaty altogether. It tried to split the difference between punishment and reconciliation, and ended up achieving neither. It wasn't punitive enough to prevent German revanchism, and it wasn't generous enough to earn German acceptance. Let's zoom out a bit, because the Treaty of Versailles didn't exist in a vacuum. It was one piece of a much larger, much more complicated puzzle. And if we're going to answer our question honestly, we need to look at some of those other pieces. Piece 1. The League of Nations. Wilson's great dream. The institution that was supposed to prevent future wars through collective security, arbitration, and cooperation. It failed utterly. And one of the biggest reasons it failed was that the United States never joined. Wilson spent the second half of 1919 trying to convince the US Senate to ratify the treaty and join the League. He went on a grueling nationwide speaking tour. He suffered a massive stroke in October 1919 that left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired. His wife, Edith, essentially ran the executive branch for months, while Wilson lay in bed. The Senate, led by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to ratify the treaty with the League covenant attached. They voted it down in November 1919, and again in March 1920. The United States, the world's emerging superpower, the country whose economic and military might could have given the League real teeth, sat the whole thing out. Without America, the League was a body without a backbone. Britain and France dominated it, but neither was strong enough on its own to enforce collective security. And when crises came, Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, Hitler's escalating violations of the treaty, the League wrung its hands and issued statements, and did nothing effective. It was a talking shop, a debating society, a monument to good intentions and inadequate follow-through. The failure of the League wasn't the treaty's fault. Exactly. It was Wilson's fault for not building domestic support before going to Paris. It was the Senate's fault for putting partisan politics ahead of global responsibility. It was the League's own structural fault for requiring unanimous decisions that made decisive action almost impossible. But the League's failure meant that the international framework for maintaining peace, the framework that was supposed to compensate for the treaty's imperfections, simply didn't work. Piece 2, appeasement. We've touched on this, but let's go deeper. The policy of appeasement, giving in to Hitler's demands in the hope of avoiding war, wasn't just cowardice or naivety. It was rooted in a genuine, widespread belief that the Treaty of Versailles had been unjust, and that Germany had legitimate grievances. When Hitler demanded the Rhineland or the Anschluss, or the Sudetenland, many people in Britain and France thought, well, maybe he has a point. The treaty had created these grievances, and decent, well-meaning people thought that addressing those grievances might satisfy Hitler and preserve peace. They were wrong, of course. Hitler wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in conquest. But the point is that the treaty's perceived unfairness made it politically and psychologically difficult for the Western powers to stand up to Hitler when it mattered. If the treaty had been seen as fair and legitimate, maybe the response would have been different. Maybe. Piece 3. The global economic system. The post-war economic order was fundamentally unstable. The gold standard created rigidity. War debts created resentment and dependency. American loans to Germany funded German reparations to France and Britain, which funded French and British debt payments back to America. It was a circular flow of money that depended on continued American lending. When that lending stopped, when the Depression hit, the whole system collapsed. This wasn't the treaty's fault in any direct sense. But the reparations were part of the unstable web. Piece 4. Ideology, fascism, Nazism, communism. These were ideological movements that had their own internal logic and momentum. Hitler didn't invade Poland because of the Treaty of Versailles. He invaded Poland because he believed in Lebensraum, living space, for the German people in the East. He believed in racial hierarchy. He believed in the superiority of the Aryan race and the need to destroy lesser races, particularly Jews and Slavs. These beliefs were not caused by the treaty. They were caused by a toxic combination of social Darwinism, anti-Semitism, pseudo-science, and personal pathology that had been festering in European culture. The treaty gave Hitler a platform, a megaphone, a set of grievances to exploit. But his ultimate goals, racial empire, European domination, genocide, went far beyond anything the treaty had done or could undo. Even if every single provision of the treaty had been reversed, even if Germany had gotten back every lost territory, every soldier, every gold mark, Hitler would still have wanted more, because his vision wasn't about restoring Germany to its 1914 borders. It was about something much bigger and much darker. And here we come to what I think is the most important point. The Treaty of Versailles was a necessary condition for World War II, but not a sufficient one. It was part of the cause, but not the whole cause. Created the soil in which extremism could grow. But someone had to plant the seeds, someone had to water them, and a whole lot of people had to stand by and watch as the weeds took over the garden. Let's bring this home, slowly, gently, like the last few minutes of a sunset. The Treaty of Versailles is one of the most analyzed documents in history, and one of the most misunderstood. For decades, the dominant narrative was simple. The treaty was too harsh. It created resentment. Resentment led to Hitler. Hitler led to World War II. This narrative was popularized by Keynes, reinforced by a generation of historians, and simplified by a century of textbook. But more recent scholarship has complicated this picture. Historians like Zara Steiner, Margaret Macmillan, Sally Marks, and others have argued that the treaty, while imperfect, was not the straightforward cause of World War II that it is often made out to be. Macmillan, in her book Paris 1919, argues that the peacemakers faced an impossible task and did a reasonably good job given the constraints they were under. Steiner, in her magisterial 2-volume History of Interwar Europe, argues that the failures of the 1930s, the Depression, appeasement, the failure of collective security, were more important than the failures of 1919. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle. The treaty contributed to the conditions that made World War II possible, but it didn't make World War II inevitable. Between 1919 and 1939, there were countless moments when different decisions could have led to different outcomes. If the United States had joined the League of Nations, if the Depression had been less severe, if the German conservatives hadn't handed Hitler the chancellorship, if France had marched into the Rhineland in 1936, if Britain and France had stood firm at Munich in 1938, if, history is full of if-ifs, and that is what makes it endlessly fascinating and endlessly debatable. There is no single cause for something as enormous as World War II. There are webs of causes, layers of causes that interact and amplify each other in ways that no one could have fully predicted at the time. The Treaty of Versailles was a thread in that web, an important thread, maybe one of the most important, but it was not the whole web. and pulling on that one thread by itself would not have unraveled everything. So when someone asks you, did the Treaty of Versailles cause World War II? You can say, it is complicated. And then you can say, let me tell you about the Paris Peace Conference, and the Big Four, and the War Guilt Clause, and the hyperinflation, and the Depression, and the League of Nations, and the policy of appeasement, and the failures of the Weimar Republic, and the cynicism of the conservative elites, and the ideology of National Socialism, and the personal pathology of Adolf Hitler. And by the time you are done, they'll either be very well informed or very much asleep. Either outcome is acceptable. There is one more thing I want to mention before we wind down. Something about the long aftermath. After World War II, the Allies learned from the mistakes of Versailles. Instead of imposing a punitive peace on Germany, they pursued a different strategy. West Germany was rebuilt with American money, the Marshall Plan, and integrated into Western European institutions. The European Coal and Steel Community, and later the European Economic Community, bound former enemies together through economic cooperation. West Germany became a democracy, a partner, and there was no World War III. This doesn't prove that Versailles was the cause of World War II, but it strongly suggests that the approach matters. How you treat a defeated enemy matters. Whether you punish or reconcile matters. The architects of the post-1945 order understood this because they had lived through the consequences of getting it wrong the first time. In a way, the greatest legacy of the Treaty of Versailles is the lesson it taught about what not to do. And that, my friends, is our story for tonight. A treaty written in a palace. A peace that wasn't really peace. A cascade of consequences that rolled across 2 decades and crashed into the deadliest war in human history. Was the treaty the cause? Partly. Was it the only cause? Definitely not. Was it avoidable? Maybe. Did anyone at the time understand what they were doing? Some did, some didn't. Mostly they were just tired, angry, grieving, people trying to make sense of a world that had just torn itself apart, and hoping, genuinely hoping, that it would never happen again. They were wrong about that, but they weren't wrong to hope. All right, that is enough history for one night. The lights are low, the blankets are warm, the Treaty of Versailles has been thoroughly discussed, and you, hopefully, are thoroughly drowsy. If you are still awake, that is okay too. Just close your eyes. Let the facts settle. Let the dates and names drift away. Good night. Everyone, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.